6.6, we've talked about positive and negative impacts of imperialism. And you guys had some wonderful responses about short term versus long term, and that there is a lot of gray area. Some things are definitely positive, some things are definitely negative, but there's a lot of things that you are unsure about, and that's exactly how I feel as well. Okay, so we left off in 1858. The Sepoy Mutiny had been raging for a year. The Sepoys, the Indians, their diversity proves to be too much. They are not able to unite, and eventually the British government takes over. This is now known as the beginning of Raj, or British rule in India. That means that no longer is there a need for the British East India Company. So all power in India belongs directly to the British government, the nation of Britain. And at that time, Queen Victoria is on the throne. She was Queen Victoria, but in 1877, her prime minister, in an attempt to suck up to her, suggests that maybe queen isn't enough of a title. It doesn't demonstrate her power, her glory, her loveliness. And he suggests that she go by the name Empress. So in 1877, she gains the title Empress of India. And this, going back to our motives, this shows political motives about the power and the prestige. She calls India the jewel in her crown, the most valuable, the most precious, because of all those resources. So there's our economic motivations. But she says that all of the work that she undertook in India was truly for the betterment of the people there. So she thinks she is helping India. There's our ideology. She thinks that by bringing Western ideologies, by bringing European civilization, she is helping the people. And until the end of her life, she did have an Indian servant with her most of the time. And this is another way to demonstrate to others, hey, just a reminder, yeah, I control India, so that nobody forgets that she has the power. With any type of empire, with any countries that are linked, there is some sort of cultural exchange. So we looked at a bunch of different things, and I wanted you to find out, are they British or are they Indian? First was cricket, British or Indian. It is originally British, but the Indians start playing it when the British are in control, and today India is always one of the top-ranked teams in the world. Polo, known as the sport of kings, comes originally from India. It was played by the Mughal emperors, but then the British see that it's very interesting, they start playing it, and now we link royalty to it. Curry is definitely Indian, but it is incredibly popular in Great Britain today because of all of this cultural exchange. Pajamas are Indian. If you think back to A Christmas Carol and Ebenezer Scrooge is wearing a night shirt, after the British Empire, we have the introduction of pajamas of pants and shirt. Shampoo, the idea of being clean, is not necessarily British or Indian, but shampoo, the word, is Hindi. Jodhpurs, these fancy pants you wear for riding horses, named after the city of Jodhpur, where they wore very baggy pants in India. And last, thugs, again, comes from India, the Thuggy tribe of highwaymen and criminals who would beat up their victims and take their money. Okay, another clip from Tracks of Empire. You can check that out over in the links. So again, going back to this ideology that the British think they are helping, they are bringing Western civilization. In some ways, this is wonderful. In other ways, it's awful. One thing that I see as definitely good is the legal system, due process of law. And we started talking about that with the Magna Carta. Creating series of laws so that if a crime is committed that goes against those laws, and there also is a system to prosecute, not just, I don't like you, I'm going to throw you in jail. That legal system, for the most part, still exists today. Now, this one's pretty gray area for me. Sati comes from a Hindi word for true. In Indian culture, it was traditional, or is traditional, to be cremated, and often this was done on a funeral pyre, sort of an altar of sticks. And sati is the practice of the widow of the man who has just died and is being cremated. The widow throws herself on the funeral pyre. Now, often as Westerners, we see this as cruel, we see this as inhumane murder, but in that culture, it was honoring her husband and also who would protect her otherwise. She is being mindful of her virtue, and well, there were some cases of women being forced, but more often than not, it was voluntary. So the British just simply outlaw this practice, but the problem is they don't take the time to understand the cultural traditions that set it up or provide any sort of alternative for these widows. So I don't know. I agree that women killing themselves probably isn't a good thing, but that the British didn't take the time to understand. They were culturally insensitive. The education system, I think this is a good one. Setting up a graded system, like similar to what we have here, still exists today, and education is incredibly important in India. In India, their class system is called castes. It has never been a legal creation or a legal system, but it has existed for centuries. You could be placed in a caste according to where you are from, according to your religious sects, according to your ethnic group. And at the very bottom are the untouchables, the unclean, those who are only allowed to do the very lowest of jobs. And at the top, there are the aristocrats. The British allow this to continue, which I think is quite hypocritical in a way. At the same time, in the mid-1800s in Great Britain, the British were all about social mobility, changing your social class through hard work and labor and luck. But they allow this to continue in India because it makes it easier for them to control the Indians. There is already an existing social system in place, so they are going to utilize it. With the religious differences, we've talked about the diversity. We have lots of Hindus, lots of Muslims, and they don't get along. And the British make this even worse when they prefer the Muslims. They give preferential treatment to the Muslims because, in the British perspective, it is a monotheistic religion. Allah is theoretically the same God as our God, as the Christian God. And this, upsets the Hindus even more. With all of this British imposition, in 1888, the Indian National Congress is created with representatives from all over the country, different religious groups, different ethnic categories, all of that. And their goal is to work with the British Empire to cooperate and sort of how can we get more independence? How can we have less British power but working with the British government? And one person who will be a part of that is Mohandas Gandhi. You probably know him as Mahatma Gandhi. That was a title he was given, but his first name is Mohandas. So he was in one of these higher castes. He was an aristocrat, essentially. And with that, he had access to many things like the British education system. So he grows up as a very sort of British Indian, and he moves to England. He studies law. He practices law in London. And then he will eventually move to South Africa. A company headquartered in Britain asked him to take care of a lawsuit down in South Africa. So he moves his family down to South Africa, and he's shocked by how he's treated. In England, he was another British gentleman, traveling in first class, going into the same restaurants as everyone else. In South Africa, because he has dark skin, he is treated as a third-class citizen. Remember, South Africa is also part of the British Empire. South Africa also had a number of Indians living there who had been brought over as labor for the British. And Gandhi is struck by this difference, that still is the British Empire, but he is being treated completely differently because of the color of his skin. So he really is inspired to start working for the benefit of the Indians. He joins the Indian National Congress and moves back to India because he wants to work for Indian independence. He sees the error of the British Empire and wants to be done with it. And sort of his biggest policy, one of the most important things we remember Gandhi for, is his support of nonviolent protest, meaning you're going to fight, but not physically. You're not going to injure someone else, but you just won't cooperate with them. If they're going to arrest you, make it difficult for them to carry you, but you're not going to fight back. And so if you want to watch the clip from the movie Gandhi from 1981, I believe, he has a great speech about why he wants to use nonviolence, because it's so different than what the British understand. The British understand violence. The British understand submissiveness. They understand beating someone else down. They don't understand peace. When Gandhi moves back to India, he gets rid of all of sort of the trappings of his Britishness. He stops dressing like a British gentleman and dresses like an Indian. He starts weaving his own cloth. That's part of why on the Indian flag today there is a spinning wheel. The Indians are going to use that cotton and start spinning their own cloth rather than buying British cloth. There's another clip about his Salt March, an example of this nonviolent protest. And he's trying to show the British that the Indians don't need the British. And he starts a campaign he calls Quit India. He tells the British, just be done. Just leave us alone. We want to be on our own. We do not need you. We do not want you anymore. Eventually, after World War II, the British have spent all sorts of money on that. They realize they don't have the money to administer India anymore. And in 1947, India does get its independence, but there still is a problem. The two major religions. We have the Hindus and the Muslims. You see there the Hindus in pink, Muslims in green. And the problem is these religious groups were fighting. So they've just figured out a way to get their independence from England, but they're still killing each other. And this is when Gandhi goes on his hunger strikes to call for peace amongst Indians. Eventually they figure out, it's not going to work. So we can't live in peace. And so the decision is made to create two separate countries, to create the country of Pakistan. So that territory over in the east that's green, that suggested that those people, those Muslims, move over to the area in green on the left. That will become the country of Pakistan, which is why if you ever see pictures of Pakistanis or on the news, they're like, oh, they look Indian. Yes, same ethnic groups, different religions. Now, that's a really great distance to go. So the creation of these new countries, these two new countries, India and Pakistan, will be made possible through the railroads. That's not to say that everyone took the trains, but it made it much easier to go by train, that system was already in place. But there are many people, many very poor people, who walk that distance. So our Take 5 started with positive or negative impacts. Let's start with the negatives. For so long, Britain holds so much power that it really does make it more difficult for India in establishing its independence. Because the British controlled so much of the resources, of the companies, it will take decades for India to really become self-sufficient. With the agriculture, the British had been using the land not very wisely. We talked about before the agricultural revolution, crop rotation and nutrient-rich crops and all that. The British weren't doing that. They just were concerned with the bottom line. They just keep growing more cotton, keep growing more tea. And this eventually tires out the land. So again, makes it difficult for the Indians. And back to our religious motives, these missionaries who come, because they see the Indians as pagans with Hinduism and the multiple gods, many missionaries really are very racist. There definitely were some who I'm sure were very soft-hearted, bringing the love of Jesus Christ, but many were racist. And that sort of develops there's a lot of resentment attached to that. But there are positive impacts. The railroads are a huge one. Without the railroads, independence wouldn't have been possible. That's why that Tracks of Empire video was called Unite and Divide. It made it possible to become India. All of the infrastructure that the British built, that meant that in 1947-48, the Indians didn't have to spend the money, spend the time in creating the things that make a country work. It already was in place when the British left. Um, we think of India now as a very dirty, sort of dusty country with not great sanitation, but compared to what it would have been without the British, vastly improved. And the creation of school systems and justice systems that still exist. Those are pretty significant. And that is it for India.